أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمخلوقين سيدنا ونبينا وشفينا أبو القاسم محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. أما بعد, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum. Today actually completes 1440 years since the hijrah of the Prophet from Makkah to Medina. So we have a long history to go through. The subject I have chosen for this year is Muslims and Europe, past, present, and future. Now I will explain the terms in the subject have been very carefully chosen. You notice that I'm not saying Islam and Europe. I'm not saying Christianity and Islam. I'm saying Muslims and Europe. Because Europe is a block of countries and also an idea in itself. And Muslims are Muslims. So the history of interaction between these two, as we will see, has been very long, sometimes fruitful, sometimes not so fruitful. But the possibilities when it has been fruitful will probably guide us as to what we can do to make the future in our interest. Because as most of you, I'm sure, are more than aware, the situation as it is developing across the world, and including Europe, does not look very comfortable for Muslims. There's a lot of finger pointing, there is a lot of issues which come up. And one of the things I want to show you is that the opponent or the other side is not necessarily Christians. They are Europeans or Americans or so on, not Christians. They may be Christians, some of them, but Christianity is not being used at the moment like it was used sometimes in the past as one of the champions of this anti-Muslim brigade. So we might find in the last lecture that we might have some alliances to build with Christians, in fact, to find our path through these issues. So I've chosen to, I have, as you can see from the program, up to now, 5 lectures. Unless Mikdad bumps me off one of them, somebody else comes, but at least 4 and hopefully 5. So today we will look at the introduction to this subject and the methodology we want to adopt. Tomorrow we want to look at the early interaction between Muslims and Europe. And by early I mean like 711 when Muslims came to Andalusia. And the subsequent developments since then. Then we want to look at what happened when there was a backlash, and so we had things like the Crusade and the Inquisition and so on, and Muslims were pushed back. But these things came back to haunt us, and we will look at things like Bosnia, Kosovo, and Cyprus, when we had very similar difficulties. And these are quite recent. The fourth issue we want to look at is, because the interaction between Muslims and Europe was not only confined to the continent. There are three particular instances where Europe or Europeans interacted extensively with Muslims. First of all, in colonization, because a lot of the countries which were colonized were Muslims. I don't think anybody has explored, in my knowledge here, how the colonial rulers interacted with Muslims in those colonies in terms of their religious and other interaction. The second interaction, which is even more interesting, is in slavery. As those of you who have read things like Roots and other books will know that a lot of the slaves taken from West Africa were Muslims. So what interaction did they have with the slave traders and the plantation owners and so on? And the third interaction, which is also in some ways most interesting one, was during the two big world wars, World War I and World War II. We will see, and not many people know, that probably 500,000 Muslims took part, for example, in World War II, and over 100,000 died fighting for the European survival. Okay? So this will also give us some insight into how Europeans have interacted with Muslims in that situation. We will end up that one by looking at the betrayal by Europe of Muslims in Palestine. And this obviously is one of the big live issues which disturbs Muslims and also creates tension with the host societies. The next issue we want to look at is demographics. Some of you may have seen there was an item, I think beginning of this week, on the demographic challenge for South Korea. And they were saying that the birth rate in South Korea has actually fallen to 0.8 child per couple. You need 2.2 to replicate, or 2.1, which means in 30 years the population of South Korea will halve. Number of old people will increase. They don't want immigration. So I don't know what they want to do. However, this demographic challenge is not unique to South Korea. It is an existential challenge in Europe, as we will see. This is where our interest is. And the reactions of different leaders, statesmen, stateswomen to this challenge, the failure to explain to the people that this is the problem. It's not only, we will see, it's not only resources. In Sweden, for example, if you have a child, the amount of financial assistance you can get is probably better than what you can earn. Even then, the birth rate is not significantly changing. So what is the implication of that? And that leads to other challenges. Coupled with the neoliberalism and the increase in inequality, then creates a sort of breeding ground for ideas which create problems. And we will see what happens. Lastly, when we come to the last session, we want to look at the future. given the present realities, which we will discuss in the third and fourth and fifth lectures, third and fourth lectures, sorry, we will see there are, of course, political challenges which we have to face, religious challenges, as I hinted in the beginning, there might be alliances to be made. But for all that, we need to understand what has happened and what happens in other places as well. I mean, if you look, for example, just let me give you one example, which is perhaps the most disturbing. About 10, 15 years ago, if I told you, what do you think about Buddhists? What would you tell me? You see, they are very peace-loving, nice people, no problems, right? If you see their behavior in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, and the kind of killing and rampage they are doing, Buddhists, not only Buddhists, Buddhist monks, you have to reevaluate your idea of Buddhists. But at the same time, we need to understand why somebody like those people whom we thought were only interested in, peace and love and compassion turn into this. Is this religion? Or is it religion being used for politics or other issues and so on? Can similar things be done here? And I think we shouldn't be as naive that cannot be done. Look at Bosnia. We look at what happened. So I don't claim to have all the answers to these questions, but I want to raise the questions so we can begin to understand both the scope and scale of the challenge and perhaps begin to address some parts of it. I don't see this to be a 1 or 2 lecture job. This is a huge, huge job, but we should know what is happening. Okay, so now let's look at this methodology. As I said, in the interaction between Muslims and Europe, the first initiative or the first, if you like, opening was made by Muslims. So if you know that the Prophet passed away in about 642 AD or 12 Hijrah. And the Muslims arrived in Spain in 711, which means about 90 years after that. If you see the distance from Arabia to Spain, across North Africa, it's not small and it's not easy. So one of the things we need to understand is how did this happen? And at the same time, they arrived in the gates of what is today Pakistan. Same kind of scale of period. So in that short time, a small group of Bedouins managed to take over quite a lot of the known world to them in terms of trading and so on, right? Now, our problem is deeper than that. The Muslims who came to Spain were, from our point of view, quite problematic. And this is where our link to Karbala also comes. They were exactly those people who had fled the Muslim parts, especially Damascus and so on, after the collapse of the Umayyad Empire, following, of course, Karbala and its aftermath, right? So there were certainly no friends of the Ahlul Bayt. And some of the things which people do not realize and understand is that what would you expect them to teach to their converts, followers, or whoever about the Ahlul Bayt in North Africa and Spain? Would you expect them to extol the virtues of the Ahlul Bayt? You wouldn't, yes? So there are books, and there is one book in particular, which is called Kitab al-Aghani by Abul Faraj al-Isfahani. I asked a couple of our good scholars, I said, this book seems very strange. The man seems to be a Shi'i. So he said to me, one very knowledgeable scholar, he said to me, this is an Umayyavi Shi'i. Because in there, he writes that the women of the Ahlul Bayt, a lot of them did not wear hijab. A lot of them were dancers and performers, and a lot of them were this and that, effectively, denigrating them. And so this went right up to Morocco and Spain. Now, this narrative is still there up to today. Although I will show you that it's been moderated. I was in a meeting in Malaysia. I'm talking now 1990-ish. And there was this Muslim feminist scholar. Her name is Fatima Marnisi. Many of you may have heard her name. She is now passed away. So, because of her feminism, she was trying to show that that kind of behavior was inherent to the family of the Prophet, and therefore it is acceptable. And she was talking from these sources. Then I said, Fatima, you are a sociologist, but you don't seem to have learned. If your sources are Umayyavi sources, what are they going to say about this? Because they cannot say we made a mess, we massacred these people because they were very good and so on. They have to show that there was something wrong there. They did. So what I'm saying is that it's still there in parts. But fortunately for us, these people in North Africa were followed by the Fatimids. Now, as the name indicates, these were the followers of Fatima Zahra alayhi salam. And therefore, they sort of purified that narrative in most parts of North Africa. Today, if you go to most North African families, the first daughter will be called Fatima. See the change? The Fatimids, of course, they established their caliphate in Cairo. They established Cairo and Azhar and all that. So the whole source of knowledge and learning started from there all the way through. But in Spain, it still remained the Umayyad narrative. And later on, when we see a lot more about Spain, we'll see if that has also colored some of the understanding of Islam. On the other side, the reaction, as we know, in the Muslim lands to Karbala was the collapse of the Umayyads, not immediately, but in a short while, and the rise of the Abbasids. And the Abbasids actually campaigned as the people who wanted to avenge the injustices done to the Ahlul Bayt. This was how they came to power. And in fact, as time went on, they were even more problematic than the Umayyads in many senses, as far as the followers of the Ahlul Bayt are concerned. But the Abbasids came to Europe through another direction, through Turkey and land. Now, as we see today, even in those days, some of the European powers were able to use the rivalry between the Umayyads and the Abbasids to play one against the other. And, you are seeing today in the Muslim world, some of the Muslims are championing this kind of power play, right? So all this will come there and inform us as to what is possible, what is doable, and not to be surprised at things which we may think are impossible or against our interest. They are not. Okay, in between all this, Europe itself has gone through quite a challenging development. One of the issues with Europe was that it became Christian in a series of stages. And then the big Christian rule was what was called the Byzantine Empire, right? Which was what we now call Eastern Christianity, which had its headquarters in Constantinople, and of course now called Istanbul. And then when the Roman emperor became Christian, they established a separate Christianity called Roman Christianity, where the Pope started to rule. So you still have today Eastern and Western Christianity, Eastern Orthodox, Western, which is Catholics mostly now. And then a third, actually two other divisions happened in Christianity. One was led by Martin Luther, the German reformer, against the practices of the Pope or the Western Christian establishment. The subject of particular concern, and this we will see when we come to the Crusades, was something called indulgences. This was the authority of the Pope to forgive sins if you pay. Very straight. You have even now the practice of confessionals and things in churches, but there is not that much payment going on. But that time, it was quite a lot of payments. And Martin Luther said, this is ridiculous. What kind of religion is this? You can do anything and then pay the Pope and then everything is done. You are going to heaven and that's it. So this Reformation started, and then Christianity, the Western Christianity itself, Catholics, were also split into several groups. In fact, the original Christians, and this is where our interest is, started to call Martin Luther and his group worse than Muslims. I said, we want to really finish these people first, then we go after Muslims, because as long as these people are there, we cannot survive. And then, of course, after that, when the authority of the Pope began to be challenged, we had the rise of Protestantism in the UK, again back to Catholicism, fighting between Protestants and Catholics, and then finally we became Anglicans. The Anglicans came to the international scene quite late, and we will see what their interaction with Muslims has been, because that's where our concern is quite a lot here, not with the Catholics as much as the Anglicans. And there are very subtle differences in understanding of Christianity between these groups. As you know, Christian doctrine in the main is based on Isa alayhi salam, right? So there are 2 or 3, if you like, principal issues here. One is virgin birth of Isa alayhi salam. The second one is the nature of Isa. Is he divine, divinely inspired, divinely conceived, or divine itself, whatever? Part of God, flesh of God. These are very subtle theological issues which they go through. And the third one, of course, is the crucifixion in their doctrine, and who was responsible for the crucifixion, and so on. But before that, the first issue, which is quite challenging for them, has been a long time, not now, is that everybody knows that Isa alayhi salam was a Jewish rabbi. So he was born in the Jewish tradition. Now, the only way you could say he's not part of us is if you say that he's either deviated from the message or whatever, right? It took quite a long, nearly 200 years, for the Jews to slowly throw them out of their synagogues and so on, before they were worshipping in those synagogues themselves, and just had a different version of the thing. So this tension between Jews and Christians was there until recently. And one of the things, when we look at the future here, we'll see how this tension has been resolved and turned against us in that sense. Okay, the final thing we want to look at is that what was the understanding of Christianity, or Christian understanding of Islam, at the birth of Islam in Makkah. We find a number of narrations. So if you like, if you look at Al-Yaqubi, which is Sirat al-Nabawi, which is the life of the Prophet, not 100% authentic, but one of the oldest, one of the most well-known seeras. There are 3 or 4 incidents on Christians and Muslims. One is before the start of the announcement of the prophethood, where he says that one day the Prophet was going, he passed through a village where there was a very learned Christian man, and he saw that when the Prophet was passing, the clouds were sheltering him and the trees were bending and all kinds of things. So he saw these as signs of some greatness in the person. Of course, he wasn't announced as a prophet then. So he told his people, look after him, because this is the foretold prophet. How authentic this is, we don't know. Because it's quite possible that it's done later on to show that the prophet was a prophet before and all, those kind of historical things. But the Christians also have this in their books, in their historical books, this incident, and we have it in Yaqubi and others. The other number of them. One is, of course, the famous incident of Mubahila, when the Christians came to discuss a number of things, and they wanted to discuss exactly those 3 or 4 principles which I told you. And at the end of the day, they couldn't agree. And so they said, okay, let's start to say, pray to Allah to save those who are right and destroy those who are wrong. And then we know what happened. The Christians didn't take the challenge and go away. The third incident, which is in some ways more interesting, is that when the Prophet sent his delegation with Ja'far ibn Abi Talib to Abyssinia, to the emperor called Negus, they, of course, presented the Prophet's request to them that we need to stay here because we are being persecuted by the kuffar of Makkah and our lives are in danger. So he said, fine. And in order to do that, they read some verses of the Quran which related to Isa alayhi salam. You know, if you look at in Surah Maryam, you will see these are beautiful verses that when Maryam came and they said, Maryam, what is this? You are not an unchaste woman. Your family is not like this. What is this? And she points to him. And they said, what is this child going to say? And he says, Inni Abdullah wa atani al-kitab. I am the servant of Allah and I have been given a book and so on. So this is like a very, for Christian ears, this is quite magical, right? So he said, stay. Then the Meccans sent people to say, we want to extradite them. And again, they read some more verses. And this time they read verses which sort of say that Isa has got some part of Allah in him. Yeah, there are some verses which can hint to you at that kind of thing. Yeah? Ruhullah, that's why we call it Ruhullah, him. So the Negus said to the Meccans, get lost. These people are actually quite close to us and we are comfortable with them. So you see the Christian-Muslim interaction here was quite interesting. The one in Makkah or Medina when they went back was a little bit more complicated because the other one is allegorical. But the idea is that Christianity at that time had an awareness that there was a new religion called Islam come into being, and they traced it through, of course, Hagar and Ismail and so on. And they thought this is not what you call the very honorable line from Ibrahim. It is, his slave wife and all those other things which we don't need to go into. But they had an idea of Islam like that. Now, when Islam spread so fast, and the Christians were not that well established at that time still, they got shocked. Is this an antichrist? This is a problem. How can they spread so fast with a message which is inferior to us? We have a better message than them from Allah. They don't have. So they started writing books how Muslim or the Quran was inferior to the Bible. Even somebody like Martin Luther, even late those days, has written a book called I Will Show You That This Religion is Totally Inferior to Our Religion. Martin Luther, who was against these indulgences and all those things, has written this kind of book. So we get to a position where Christians build an idea of Islam. Islam spreads very fast, and they are really taken aback as to what to do. But at that time, they didn't have the power or anything to do anything. It was just beginning to try to understand, try to denigrate. Even if you see the first few translations of the Quran by them, they are quite, derogatory. The most common, if you like, idea they got, which sort of explained to them that, yeah, it can happen, is that either the Prophet was a magician or mad. If you say he's mad, then you say, okay, whatever he's saying is fine, doesn't matter. It doesn't have that weight, yeah? Or magician, which means these are tricks. So they try to park it in some way. Now, what we have to see is that these initial understanding of Islam and Muslims, did it seep into the European psyche to generate the Crusades and other things, or other things happened which made that? If it did sink, then we have to see that those things, have they still been there somewhere in the narrative which may come still to haunt us, or is there other issues? The final point we want to take up today is that, as I said, Christianity itself is both evolving and changing its nature. It's now no longer the state religion, for example, in the UK and other places. We're supposed to be officially a secular state. Christianity has a place in the state structure as being one founding inspiration for the state. It's no longer the state. In its place, we have secularism and liberalism. And fortunately, yesterday we had this nice presentation on liberalism. What does it mean? What does it purport to do? And it seems to have started off as an all-knowing philosophy and slowly being challenged. And I think up to 5 years ago, we ended in a place where we said, okay, there are many paths to the truth, and this is one. And so we as liberals accept every path as long as it doesn't disturb anybody else. So that's the root of multiculturalism and other things. But now we have, Cameron was the first one to talk about it. He started to say that we don't want multiculturalism. We want muscular multiculturalism. Muscular multiculturalism is saying that you do as we say. And we think our values are better than your values. So slowly we are getting back to the old one. This poses challenges, and it poses challenges to churches and all faith groups as well. That's why I'm saying that at some point, the battle is going to be between faith and no faith. It's not going to be between Christianity and Islam. It's going to be faith and no faith. And we might need to have alliances there, right? Obviously, there are other political developments, post-colonial times, and political developments are quite simple. You can say when this poor man was gruesomely murdered, Khashoggi, the only thing Trump could say that they're buying $300 billion of arms from us, so we don't want to do anything. So there's no values here. It's just quite transactional, right? So if you have that kind of issue, then you don't know what can happen. Tomorrow, if somebody says, I'll buy 500 billion, will you ditch them, finish them? Have you got any moral principles? If there are moral principles, you can work with them. If there are no principles, you find it difficult. So to conclude, we see that this understanding of Muslims and Europe in particular, the Americans have a different story. the whole of America is based on the extermination of the native population, and then the use of slave labor to build their empire. So they will obviously sympathize with anybody else who is doing that in the world. How can they say you are doing wrong when they have done that? But that is a separate issue. We are looking at Europe as our problem. So we see that beginning here. And why I want to present this in Muharram, especially, is that this is one of the times when we reflect on the situation of Muslims. And again, in facing and challenging these narratives, we have to take lessons from the movement of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, saying that we cannot abandon principle in order to gain political advantage, social advantage, or whatever. Certain principles have to be maintained at whatever cost. There are things which we can do, yes, there are accommodations which we can make, but certain principles have to stay. And inshallah, I hope over the next 4 sessions, we will dig into these issues in detail and maybe come up with some bigger questions. I don't think answers at this stage. Assalamu alaikum.
We have some time for some questions. So is there anyone that would like to ask a question from either side?
Thank you very much, Uncle. It seems to me, I know we haven't started the topic very much, but the issue of Europe is almost a racist issue, because Europe isn't just Europe. North America is Europe, Australia is Europe, South Africa is Europe. And in general, the media and almost it's infected our thinking. Europeans are seen as the mic is cutting out. Europeans are seen as the superior beings compared to the rest of the world. Where does that come from? Is that them or is that us?
No, it is, you're right. There is a large, and you'll see it, a large element of racism. In fact, a few things, even quite late, last 20, 30 years. You know, for example, when the first heart transplant was made in South Africa by Dr. Barnard, Christian Barnard, it was a black man's heart which was put into a white person. And this caused a big uproar. So that the man may grow up as a black person now after the new heart, and this is disaster, and so on. So there is there, but and obviously the whole of slavery and other things which we'll see is a race narrative. The whole of colonialism is a race narrative. But lately, just like Christianity itself, the race narrative is changing. Today, if you see the opposition here to Eastern European immigration is greater than to Asian immigration. And those are white people. So what is the problem with white people? Poles, especially, or Hungarians, or Romanians, or whatever. There's no race element here, right? So this is a bit confusing for me, how this narrative changed into immigration. Or, for example, in this latest terrorist atrocity in the United States, it was Mexicans who are also, in terms of color, same as the Americans, a lot of them. So it wasn't race, it's not like black, white, or Asian, white. It's more subtle. I think there is some other issue there. So yes, race was a very big, just like Christianity. Previously, Christianity was a very big element in the struggle and in the fight and enmity. But today, pure race narrative is evolving into something else, and we will need to see what that is as well, right? And this is important because we cannot now say that it is only race.
Do we have any other questions from either side? Okay, thank you very much. We'll end it there. Can we have a salawat?